there we go. Sometimes, excuse me, after someone has a traumatic brain injury, their social behavior can be different and their emotions can seem a little bit different. So I wanted to talk to you today because I want to focus on that, and I want to bring a message of compassion and a message of hope that all these things do get better over time. So everyone should remember that interacting with other people is one of the most complicated things that our brains do. When you're talking to someone else, there's just so much to pay attention to in a conversation, and if you're talking to multiple people at once, there's even more going on. So it gets very complicated. So it is hard work for the brain to interact with other people. So it's only reasonable that if the brain is injured and it's recovering, that's going to have some effect on social relationships and on emotions and feelings. Okay, so I'll list a few things that might be affected by traumatic brain injury. Some of the things that are symptoms, sometimes, of traumatic brain injuries. Communication and conversation can go differently. So it might be hard with a person for brain injury to pay attention as closely as they used to what's going on in a conversation, or to pay attention for as long. So that might mean a few things. One thing is it might be better just to interact with one or two other people than a lot of people at once when those attentional demands are really challenging. Another thing is that conversations just might be more tiring and cause more fatigue for the person with brain injury. So it's important for people around them to understand that. And having difficulty with paying attention and focusing for a long time might have some other consequences for conversation too. Maybe the person with a brain injury, in more severe cases, they just might keep talking and talking and talking once they start, and have trouble inhibiting and stopping to let the other person have a turn to say something. So that can affect social relationships also. Now sometimes with more severe brain injuries, it can make it harder for the person to recognize other people's facial expressions. So maybe it would be harder to see a sad face and recognize that that's someone feeling sad. So if that happens, it doesn't mean that the person with the brain injury doesn't care that the person's sad. It means that the person with the brain injury just may not recognize the facial expression. In the same way, it might be hard to recognize body language. Same thing, all these things about reading other people are kind of complicated, and they could be affected by brain injury. So it may affect how the person comes across in a social interaction. Now, if it's harder to read faces and body language, one thing that might be harder is to figure out what other people are up to. What are their intentions? So, does someone mean to harm you? Do they mean to help you? Do they like you? Do they not like you? Are they annoyed by you? I know one guy in a legal case that I worked on really had a lot of difficulty figuring out who his friends were and who his enemies were. He would say, oh, that guy's great, he's my really good friend, and then the attorney would go talk to this person as a witness and be like, I can't stand that guy. So he just wasn't doing a good job tracking. Now this was someone with multiple severe brain injuries, so he had pretty severe problems in that area. But sometimes for someone with a more severe brain injury, it can be more difficult to tell whether someone's well-intentioned or not. And we'll talk later on about some of the follow-on effects that might have in different kinds of social relationships. Now also, sometimes after a more severe brain injury, the person can have, some people will have flattened emotions. They're just not experiencing emotions as strongly as they did before. It's like emotions are sort of dulled down. Other people, in contrast, might experience that they're having more trouble controlling feelings than they used to. So they might get angry more easily, or they might cry more easily. And I remember talking to one guy on the phone, maybe he was about 9 months out from his brain injury, and within the space of about 2 sentences, he went from sounding pretty cheerful and just asking for some information to crying, and no, it wasn't anything I said. And I just said, I don't think so. And then back again in 2 sentences to sounding pretty upbeat. And so his emotions were just highly variable, and that can happen sometimes after brain injury as well. And obviously, if someone's having more difficulty controlling their feelings, you can see how that might have an effect on social relationships. Obviously, sometimes people also feel depressed or anxious after brain injury. Now, there's lots of good reasons why that might be the case, but it's also the case that certain brain circuits that help control mood and maintain positive mood can be affected by the brain injury as well. Another emotional change that happens sometimes is in the sense of humor. The very areas of the brain that allow us to understand and appreciate humor can be affected by brain injury. And so maybe the person may laugh at different things than they used to, or not laugh as easily, or maybe they tell different kinds of jokes than they used to. And it's important to understand that that's just a change and a symptom, like anything else that can occur after brain injury. Another thing that can often be a challenge is it can be difficult for someone with a traumatic brain injury to control their impulses. This might mean blurting something out that it would be nicer to keep to yourself. Like you see your friend who just had a haircut and say, is that a new haircut? That looks terrible. Now everybody else around you might be thinking that the haircut looks terrible too, but they're just not saying it. So that learning to control just letting something out like that is an important part of rehab in traumatic brain injury. And impulse control, controlling those kinds of things, that's something you work on and practice a lot in rehabilitation. Now sometimes this whole set of symptoms here, this whole list of things and other things beside, they just get labeled as behavioral problems. Excuse me for a minute. I don't like the phrase behavioral problems. It's so vague. It applies to absolutely everything that human beings do. Bending down and tying your shoe is a behavior. So I like to be more specific and talk about not only specifically social issues and emotional issues, but which ones specifically are problems for that particular person. I think it helps to be specific. Now, these changes in social and emotional experience, social and emotional behavior, they are a direct result of certain circuits in the brain being affected by brain injury. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain here, because I hope that understanding a little bit about the brain and how it's affected by brain injury will lead to greater compassion and understanding for these kinds of issues for people with brain injury. Now, it's kind of funny to think that who we are and our personalities and how we act is dependent on certain circuits in the brain. But it's true. Everything that we do, everything about us is dependent on certain circuits in the brain. A lot of research in the last 20 years has been done on what neuroscientists call the social brain. So that just means the parts of the brain that help us understand other people, that help us relate to other people, that are involved when we experience emotions, that help us to control our emotions. So I've highlighted some of those areas in purple here on the slides. That's what we call the social brain. It's a set of brain regions that are involved in social behavior and emotions. Now obviously social and emotional areas are interconnected. They're connected to the rest of the brain. So this picture on the bottom is a map of some crucial connections between different areas of the brain, and I've highlighted in green some of the connections here that are so important for social behavior and emotions. Now, certain parts of the brain are more likely to be affected by traumatic brain injury than other areas. And guess which parts of the brain they are? These areas highlighted in red. So you can see that there's a lot of overlap in areas that are likely to be affected by traumatic brain injury and between the social and emotional areas of the brain. So I've actually physically overlaid those two slides over each other. Now you can see that there's a few red areas that can be affected by traumatic brain injury that are not in the social and emotional parts of the brain. But you can also see that almost all of the social and emotional areas of the brain are definitely can be affected by traumatic brain injury. So I don't think there's a lot of specific education about this fact for survivors of TBI and their families, so that's why I do what I do. I like to get the word about that out there. I think it's just really important to understand that Changes in social behavior and changes in emotions they're just another symptom, like memory problems are a symptom after traumatic brain injury. They're just a result of what's happening in the brain. It's not something the person with a brain injury can help. However, even if some of these social and emotional issues are a challenge right now for a particular person, it doesn't mean they always will be. They can change and improve over time. They will not always be a challenge. So that's important to remember. There are medications and therapy that can help with emotional issues. There are rehabilitation programs that focus specifically on social skills. Those usually involve working in groups with other people who have brain injury. And even if you're involved in a type of rehab that's called cognitive rehab, it still improves social issues and social relationships. When your rehab helps you pay attention for longer, or your therapy and rehab help you sleep better, then that improves social relationships too. Social and emotional challenges after traumatic brain injury are like any other challenge after traumatic brain injury. Things get better even if they get better slowly. How someone is today is going to be different from how they are a year from now, and that's important to keep in mind. Okay, support networks are such an important part of life after brain injury. The focus that we wanted to have for today was living with a brain injury, and it's really important what support networks you have around you. Who else is going to understand what you're going through? Well, other people who have been through the same thing are really going to get it. And it doesn't mean that your friends and family and people around you who haven't had brain injuries aren't going to be compassionate and understanding. But who else is really going to get it in that deep way? Other people who've been through the same thing. So that's why I think that BAC support groups for survivors of TBI and for their families are so important. Because who else is going to get it that way? And if you're in a rehab program where part of what you do is work in groups, then other people in your group in rehab are also people who are going to get it. So those people are a really important part of social support. Now, family often does get some education about brain injury, either at the hospital or maybe at your rehab facility. But usually your friends don't get any education. So if one of your symptoms, for example, of traumatic brain injury is that you get tired after an hour of talking to someone, and then you just want to leave because you're exhausted, well, your friends aren't necessarily going to understand that unless you explicitly say it to them, unless you explain it to them. Some people with TBI do pretty well early in the day, but they're tired out by the evening. Well, when do people in our society get together to socialize? They usually do it in the evenings, and that may not work the best for people particularly soon after a traumatic brain injury. Now, I know a lot about brain injury, or at least I like to think I do. And still, when a friend of mine was in a car accident, I still didn't quite get it that she didn't do as well at night. She had to tell me and explain that to me, that it was best for us to get together earlier. So I didn't clue in, even though I know about brain injury. So you really may have some explaining to do to your friends, or get your spouse or family to help you explain things to friends. Another person I know with brain injury used to be sort of the center of his group of friends. He was the one who organized parties and get-togethers, and he kept people in touch with each other. He couldn't do that after his bicycle accident and his traumatic brain injury. For about 2 years, it just took too much concentration and effort for him to do that. So his social life changed, and in fact his friends' social lives changed too, as a result of the fact that because of his brain injury, he couldn't do what he used to do. And the sad thing is that his friends were not all very compassionate about it. They would actually sometimes be kind of pushy about it. Hey, how come you never call me anymore, man? When you have another party, hey, we want to have a party, you should have a party. So they really weren't getting it. They almost would get kind of mad at him sometimes. So I think explaining to friends can really help. My friend who had a brain injury was rear-ended by a semi going 50 miles an hour, and even though her TBI was classified as mild, it really affected her life. So I'd like to read to you something she said to me recently on the phone that she wanted me to say today. I lost friends after my brain injury. Friends and family, out of the goodness of their hearts, would listen to me describe my memory problems, my problems finding words, and they would try to sympathize by saying something like, "Oh, I have those kind of problems sometimes too, it's no big deal." They meant well, but what it actually did was make me feel minimized and invisible. It made me feel like they didn't really believe that I was struggling and having challenges, and I was just making up my problems or exaggerating them. Brain injury is a hidden disability. It doesn't show up physically, and these kind of comments made me feel invisible, marginalized, and disbelieved. In many ways, I think that the social and emotional challenges people face after traumatic brain injury are almost like the hidden disability within the hidden disability. Everybody talks about memory and attention, or learning to get some movement back if that's been affected, but people don't talk as much about the social and emotional effects of brain injury. So that's kind of why I want to shine a light on that. So if you've had a brain injury, or someone you love has had a brain injury and they're having trouble with social relationships or emotions, that really needs to be seen and acknowledged. That's why I wanted to talk about this today. People are, in a lot of ways, very self-centered. So if you act differently than you used to, or you do something different than you used to, they might take it personally. Because, hey, it's all about them, right? So it may be important to educate friends so that they don't take things personally that might be different now. Or ask your spouse or family members to help you educate friends. So that's why I put together one of the handouts for today, Educating Your Friends and Extended Family. It's something you can give to your friends for them to read, or I know a lot of friends probably aren't going to read something you give them to read, but it can form the basis for a conversation about how things are different after brain injury. Now, not everything on this handout is going to apply to every person with a brain injury. Each person has a unique situation and a unique set of things that are going on for them. So that's why I want to make it available as a Microsoft Word document, so you can just get it, change it, make it so it fits you, it suits you, and it fits your circumstances. I hope that that will be helpful for some people. Maybe we should take a break for some questions now?
They're over here.
Yes.
The hardest thing that I struggle with is my patience. Because people don't have patience with me. So I don't have patience with them. And that's the hard part, my temper and my patience. Because I just don't get it.
Let me repeat that so everybody around the stage can hear what you said too, because I think that's really important, and I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with. She said, one thing that is an issue for me is patience. Other people aren't patient with me, and so I'm not patient with them. So that's an issue. My temper, my frustration, my patience with other people. And is there something more you want to add to or ask about that?
Some people just don't get it.
Some people just don't get it. So, and Brain Injury Awareness Month is a good time to think about how to reach out so that other people do get it. Nobody in our culture is taught about brain injury, except for a few neuropsychologists, maybe the occasional lawyer, rehab specialists. Unless you're a professional who's working in that area, or you're someone who's just been in an accident and had a brain injury yourself, or someone you love has had a brain injury yourself, we don't get a lot of education about it. And I hope that that's changing, and so that's part of what Brain Injury Awareness Month is about. So we hope that we can reach out so that other people that you interact with socially will get it more and more. Yes, another question over here?
Yes, at the beginning you stated that, well, it sounded unless you had a brain injury recently, you will see yourself against it. Does it get better? Because recently, mine has been a while, and when is it supposed to get better? Well, how does it get better? What am I doing wrong?
You're not doing anything wrong. So the question was that I said early on that things do get better and change and improve over time. This woman said that that hasn't been her experience, that recently it's stayed about the same, or some things maybe even have felt a little bit worse. So she wanted to know, when does it get better and how does it get better? I think that there's often sort of some very rapid improvement at first, and then things kind of level off, and it may progress more slowly. But there are lots of kinds of rehabilitation that can help, working with a counselor, even working with a folk rehab counselor, practicing things that are difficult for you over and over and over again, and that may mean practicing something thousands of times in some cases. Those kinds of things do produce improvement over time. And part of what Denver Options and BIAC and TBI Trust Fund and Colorado Connections do is try and connect people with services and situations where they can get access to that kind of help. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that at the end. Any other questions from around the state? Okay.
Well, yeah, I was wondering, you said that there was a document that we could have, that we would be able to share this with people. And how do we get that document?
At the very end of the talk, I'll put up the website where you can download it directly. We've got paper copies here. And then for people around the state, the question was how to get that handout about educating your friends and family. So at the end of the talk, I'll put that up on my website. For local BIPN leaders, that's Brain Injury Professional Network, and BIAC support groups, those leaders, I think Liz emailed them copies of the handouts too, so they should have electronic copies so you can get it from them. But you can also download it directly.
We'll make it available on our website too.
And Liz says it'll be available on the BIAC website too, so we'll talk about that. Oh, we've got one more online question. Hang on.
Can you hear me? So the question was, what about making sure doctors, even neurodoctors, are educated about TBI, especially when it's out of their area?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to read it again. What about making sure that doctors, even neurodoctors, are educated about TBI, especially when it's out of their area? Well, that's a huge issue. What I'd love to do is just round up every doctor in the state of Colorado and we just corral them for a weekend and just make them listen. And then we get paid money for that too. Because doctors pay a lot of money for continuing education. I think it would be great to do that. I would recommend, it would be great if some of the education grants to the TBI Trust Fund were for reaching out to doctors, especially when you're talking about someone who's sort of a general practice doctor. But even neurologists who maybe typically see Alzheimer's cases but don't see a lot of brain injury, they may not be very familiar with it. And so it's really a problem. In fact, when I was giving a talk at the Canadian Brain Injury Association, a young woman there said, I was talking about social symptoms of traumatic brain injury. Said, well, you're talking to us about social skills and traumatic brain injury, but what about doctors and social skills? Because my doctor told me that. It's good, we'll pause for people to laugh about it. My doctor told me that I shouldn't have any hope and things weren't going to get better and I was just going to be a vegetable. And no one should ever, ever, ever say that to another person. You cannot say that. You don't know that. And it's scientifically doesn't seem to be true. That doesn't mean that things aren't going to be challenging for a long time and that improvement might not be slow and gradual. So I didn't really have anything to say about doctors' social skills in that sense. One more question?
Oh, I was just going to add, I had a doctor tell me that, and I was on my way to Denver Options where Londa Martin said, oh, I hope you didn't believe him.
Very good. She said she had a doctor tell her that, but she was on her way to Denver Options where someone said, well, I hope you don't believe that. So don't believe that if a doctor says it to you. All right, let's move on and talk about the next topic. Okay, once you go back to work, a lot of the same issues can come up at work that come up with friends. Again, your family gets some education about brain injury, but your coworkers, for the most part, they're not going to know anything about brain injury. As one woman here in the audience said, they just don't get it. So I I think if it's possible, it's worthwhile to choose your work situations carefully if you have that possibility. The more people you talk to at once, the more demanding that social situation is going to be, and the more attention it requires. So it's easier to interact with just one or two people than to talk to 5 people at once. So working in really crowded environments, like this grocery store, might cause more fatigue and just be more wearing on your cognitive skills than working in a situation with just 1 or 2 other people. It may be important to explain that to your coworkers, that right now meetings with just 1 or 2 people at a time really are going to work better for you. Also, work is a much stricter environment than home or with friends. You can talk about things with your friends and your family that you absolutely can't talk about at work that can get you fired. So I think it's important to make sure that you've really worked on some of those issues in rehabilitation. For instance, controlling the impulse just to say something when it comes into your head. So I knew one guy who was in one of my research studies. He had a pretty severe brain injury, and he worked volunteering at a hospital. And unfortunately, he used to blurt out inappropriate things to the nurses at the hospital that he found attractive. And that made them very uncomfortable. So he was asked not to continue working and volunteering at that hospital. So I think it's important to work on that kind of issue in rehab. If that kind of issue keeps coming up in a work situation, voc rehab counseling, there are lots of ways to work on that kind of issue. Now, if you're in a situation where you go back to work but you keep getting fired or you keep getting written up by your boss, you may want to find someone to work with you, an advocate. It might be a vocational rehab counselor, someone you find through Denver Options, or maybe through your workplace employee assistance program. Some companies have employee assistance programs. Or it might be a life skills coach. I know that here in the Denver Brain Injury Professionals Network, we have a couple of people who are life skills coaches, and they themselves have had traumatic brain injuries, so they do get it. And they help with time management and organization, and they can help with advocacy in the workplace and working on social skills for the workplace. So all those things that might be issues. Now, employers really should provide some accommodation for a disability. They really should. However, what employers should do and what employers actually do in the real world, unfortunately, there's sometimes a little bit of a gap there. So I think it's really important to have someone who's on your side. And again, the organizations who helped organize this today can help connect you with some resources for that. Do we want to take a break and talk about workplace issues?
Sure.
Okay, we'll take one more break for questions.
We just got one from Durango that says, if I'm not sure that I'm understanding or being understood, I try to use different words or written words or other modes. Is this good or distracting? Knowing that she is unique, or he.
Okay, I'm just going to reread that just in case my mic didn't pick up your voice, Matt. If I'm not sure that I'm understanding or being understood, I try to use different words or written words or other modes. Is this good or distracting? I know that everyone is unique. Well, everyone is unique, and I guess it also depends on the person that you're talking to. So it might be the case that for some of your friends or family, or maybe even other people in a brain injury support group, that would work really well. For others of them, maybe they would find it distracting. So that's something you can just check in with the person. And I think it's worth saying something very explicit and clear, like, I'm having trouble understanding exactly what you're saying. Can you say it to me another way? In fact, I use that line with my husband sometimes. What was that about taking out the garbage? And also, if you're not sure that they're understanding you, stopping and just explicitly checking in with them, saying, do you understand what I'm saying? That can just sort of open communication lines because they can say yes or no. And I think far from being distracting, that can actually help a conversation go more smoothly than just going on and assuming that someone knows what you're saying. Great question. And that can be very important in the workplace too, especially if you're in a situation where you're doing customer service or working with the public.
So we got a comment that came in from Grand Junction for the support member.
Okay. All right, we've got a comment from Grand Junction. After 30 years as a TBI survivor, I've learned that self-forgiveness and tolerance of my failings or errors is essential. Thank you for saying that. That is so true. And that is why I want to talk about what we're talking about in this group today. What happens in our society is that, we get it that someone who's in a wheelchair can't help it, that they can't walk. We get it even that someone with Alzheimer's can't help it if they don't remember. But somehow when it comes to stumbling in a social interaction, doing something that other people see as inappropriate, or having an emotional outburst, people don't have that same compassionate reaction. They tend to respond with judgment and treat it as if you've done something wrong. And you haven't. That's why I showed all those brain pictures. It's just a result of what's going on in the brain, and it's something that can be worked on. But it's definitely going to be a challenge. And so I think that self-forgiveness, compassion compassion begins at home for yourself. And on that same kind of forgiveness and understanding from other people around you in your social network can be so, so important.
One more question.
Okay, one more question's coming in online. I'm a survivor of a bike accident, diagnosed with post-concussion frontal lobe syndrome. Do I need a neuropsychologist evaluation? Do I need an MRI? How long will my severe depression last? After how long will this be considered long-term? Oh boy, nobody's giving me easy questions. I'm a little biased because my training is in psychology and neuroscience, so I always think that an evaluation by a neuropsychologist is a good idea. I think it should be by a good neuropsychologist. I think that can give you a very clear idea of strengths and weaknesses, and what things to work on, and when you're working on something that might not work as well, you need to know what your strengths are also, so you know what you can fall back on. An MRI may or may not tell anything useful, so it really depends on what your health insurance situation is, and whether that's going to show anything. Depression. There are many, many ways to treat depression. I didn't bring that slide. I have other brain diagram slides that I can show that the very parts of the brain that help us maintain a positive mood can be affected when the brain is injured. Now those can get better also, and because it's a whole network of different areas, there are lots of different ways to intervene. If you're severely depressed and it doesn't feel like it's getting better, I think it's worth finding someone who can be like a healthcare advocate for you, get some care management, and push for the mental health care system to do something that's really going to improve that. It might be medications, it might be therapy, it might be something else, cognitive therapy. It might be all of those things together. There are things that help. I think it's also probably important to recognize, yes, the symptoms you're experiencing are real. Your experience of them is valid. And again, that kind of self-forgiveness and understanding where you are. And finding support around you of people who can understand where you are. Those kinds of things can help with depression also. All right, so we're going to move on. Just something really simple. Okay. So long-term relationships. When you have social and emotional symptoms of a traumatic brain injury, that can really affect long-term relationships. There are some statistics on divorce after traumatic brain injury. Couples where one of the people has had a traumatic brain injury are slightly more likely to get divorced than couples where neither one of them has had a traumatic brain injury. I can't help but think that some of those divorces might have been unnecessary. That if the spouse maybe had understood more about the social and emotional effects of a traumatic brain injury, that maybe it might have been easier for them. So but I don't want to deny that TBI is hard on the spouse because they've been used to having a partner who can help with everything, who can help with the kids and with the house and with the yard and all of the things that are involved in having a life together. And now more of that may fall on the spouse. So that can be certainly difficult. Support for the partners and spouses of people with traumatic brain injury is so important. So let's hear it for those BIAC support groups. And there are other organizations that run support groups as well. I think also educating the family is important so that they understand what's going on. You shouldn't have one of these things without the other, I think. You don't just educate the family and say, okay, these are the things that are going to be difficult for the person with a brain injury now, and so you're going to have to take care of this. Go do it on your own with no support. They should be able to get support after they get educated about what to expect. One example I'll think about. This was a couple I talked to. The family used to, before the husband's brain injury occurred, the family used to get together in the evenings and they would all sit in the living room and watch television together. And that was kind of their family together time, sharing some laughs together. After the brain injury, the husband just couldn't do that. It was just having the TV and everybody in the room at the same time. It was just too much. It was too stimulating. And he would just eventually leave the room and just go off in a room by himself where it was quiet, because that's sort of what he could handle right then. And at first his wife saw that as, he's rejecting us. He's rejecting the family, he's rejecting me, he's rejecting our family together time. But his rehab counselor talked with her and let her know that no, he's not, it's not a rejection. It's not something you should take personally. It's just what he needs to do right now because it's what he can handle right now. Now, if anger outbursts are one of the problems that someone with a traumatic brain injury has, obviously that can be very difficult for the spouse. I think about another guy who was involved in one of my research studies who had this problem. He would just, when some little frustration would occur, he would completely fly off the handle and go into a real rage and start yelling at his wife and the kids. His wife was a very interesting person. She somehow just didn't take that personally. She would just sort of stop and step back and say, honey, you're doing that thing again. This level of temper is way out of proportion to what's actually happened here. And what's also, that would help calm him down. He would just stop and then they were able to address it. Now, that's rare. There aren't very many human beings who can be yelled at and just not take it personally. That's just a hard thing to do. And I think also it's probably kind of rare that saying something like that to someone when they're in a rage would help calm them down. It might just make them more mad. In his case, they were very lucky. That sort of worked out for them. But I think it's also important to recognize that the anger and the temper issues, again, physically, are probably something that for a while the person with a brain injury is not going to be able to help. Literally, physically, it's like the fuse is shorter. So things that are small frustrations really can cause an explosion. It's like a reaction. And it doesn't, and so I'm sort of stuck in the position of saying, well, don't take it personally, while knowing that it's actually impossible not to take it personally a little bit. So, but here's the secret to happy long-term partnerships. Here's what research shows. And this is for all of us, not just couples where one person or both people have had a brain injury. Couples who do 5 positive things for each other, for every negative thing they do to each other, tend to stay together longer than couples that have a different balance of positive and negative. So if something bad happens, if you blow up and you get angry at your spouse, then after you've calmed down afterwards, it might be really good to do 5 nice things for them. Apologize. Tell them you love them, that you didn't mean to hurt them. Figure out a way to communicate and be on the same side about whatever issue or frustration was there. Clean up something around the house. Whatever it is that your spouse thinks would be something nice to do for them. I think the good news is that when there are frustrations and challenges in a relationship, you can counteract that by adding in lots of good stuff too. And that really could work for anybody. And all relationships have challenges and frustrations, and times when people get mad at each other, because human beings, we're sometimes difficult. Okay. Well, if you're not already married when you have your TBI, or in a long-term relationship when you have your TBI, you might be thinking about dating. Now, I honestly think that of all the social things that we do in life, dating is the most complicated. Maybe it would be more complicated to play chess while you're juggling, while you're assembling a rocket ship, like all three things at the same time. Maybe it would be more complicated, but maybe not. And it's complicated for everyone. Traumatic brain injury, no. It's not as if people without brain injuries are sitting around going, oh yes, it's very easy for me to call someone up and ask them out, and very easy for me to make conversation on a date, and very easy for me to tell whether the person likes me or not. It's just an inherently difficult and stressful thing to do, and yet we do it. So, actually in the early stages of recovery from a traumatic brain injury, I don't actually recommend dating. I think this is something to wait a little while to do. You want to have already worked on some of these social and emotional issues and rehabilitation and therapy before you get out and start dating. That's just my perspective. But there's a couple reasons why I think this. On dates, what people are doing is they're really observing and judging each other. And in particular, they're observing and judging each other's social skills. They're observing and judging each other's behavior on that date, which is why dates are so stressful. You know, they're just trying to figure out, is this someone I get along with? Is this someone I laugh with? Is this someone that I feel like I want to be with for a longer period of time than just, you know, this lunch date that we've made? Another guy who was in one of my research studies used to be an accountant, kind of shy, didn't talk much. Then after his brain injury, he was one of those people who would just talk, and really had trouble reining it in and inhibiting it and letting the other person get a word in edgewise. So he would ask women out on dates. He wasn't shy anymore. And then they would go out on dates, and he would do all the talking. And it turned out that the women didn't like that. They didn't know anything about brain injury. So they were thinking, well, you know, he's not interested in me, or he's just really self-centered, or, you know, they didn't understand that actually he probably really would have liked to hear what they had to say. He just was having trouble stopping that. So he didn't get a lot of second dates, and he found dating to be really kind of a frustrating and frankly a little depressing experience. But after he'd worked in rehab on some of those conversational skills and on turn taking and learning to just consciously stop himself so that the other person could come in and say something, then those dates went better. And so he didn't find it as frustrating an experience. So that's one of the reasons I think it's good to wait. There's a second reason I think it's worthwhile to wait to start dating till some recovery from the brain injury has occurred. And it's kind of a bummer, I hate to say it, but you can't trust everyone. Some people are out to get their hands on your money, some people are out to use you, and just not everyone is a good person. So, I know a young man with a brain injury who he had a lot of challenges in terms of his social interaction. And he started talking to a young woman at a grocery store, and she figured out something was up with him. She kind of latched onto him, started calling herself his girlfriend, which thrilled him because he was very excited to have a girlfriend. Now, it's not like she was his girlfriend in the sense that they went out on dates, or even that she let him kiss her, or anything else. Their dates, as it were, mostly consisted of going to the automatic cash machine and her saying, I'm your girlfriend, so I need some money, and him taking out the maximum amount of cash he was allowed to take out that day, and her running off with it. Not much of a relationship. And so I think it's a good idea to wait to start dating until you're worked on having the skills to be assertive when you're in a situation with someone who's unpleasant and who's trying to hurt you. In that case, his family got involved and helped get her out of the situation. All right, internet dating. A lot of people meet this way now. I think I've heard that about 1/3 of marriages that occur nowadays are people who met online, because everyone's so busy, that's how people meet. Now this is a topic that merits a whole day in and of itself, but it goes back again to this issue of who you can trust. So on the internet, anyone can pretend to be anyone. Married people can pretend to be single. I've even heard of men pretending to be women. It's just any number of weird characters out there in the world of cyberspace. And some people are just looking for someone that they can take advantage of. So, you know, that's not most people, but there's some people out there who are not particularly honest. So here are some safety rules for internet dating. So never tell the other person your home address until you've already been out on several dates, 5 or more dates. It keeps creepy stalkers away from you if they turn out not to be someone that you really want to have around. I think always the first time you meet the person, actually probably the first several times you meet the person, always meet in a public place where there are other people around, and always make sure that someone you know who's close to you knows that you're out meeting a stranger. So that if something happens, someone knows about it. I also think it's a good idea to try and talk on the phone and meet in person as soon as possible after connecting online. It screens out people who aren't really serious about meeting someone. It tells you right away whether the person is who they claim to be. Oh, that's a woman, that's a man. And it just stops the whole train of unrealistic fantasies that inevitably start when you have an email correspondence back and forth. So I say cut the emailing and move to talking and meeting in person as soon as possible. I think it's also good with anyone you're starting to date, whether you meet them through the internet or not, to have your family and friends meet them and kind of check them out. That way you kind of have other people in your social network. You can use their social judgment to help make some evaluation of this person too, not just your own. So I just think wait, go slow, and kind of ease back into the dating part of social life. You want to pause for some more questions?
That one that went back to a little bit about the employment, what might be able to be
Okay.
towards, you know, personal relationships as well.
Okay. Wouldn't admitting that you have a TBI in a completely professional setting, such as an attorney, put you at a disadvantage? Cause you to be discriminated against? Boy, I wish I could say, no, that never happens. Unfortunately, yes, that absolutely can happen. And that's why it's a good idea to make sure that you have some kind of advocate. It's not technically legal to discriminate against people in workplaces because of disabilities, but it does happen, and it happens all the time. And I think particularly with brain injury, because with so much of who we are, we think of as, and rightly so, as involved in our brains, that you never know what kind of reaction that someone's going to have. So it's a good idea to have a counselor, a coach, some kind of advocate working with you if you're going to be out at work about having a brain injury. By the way, the same thing might be true in dating as well. That's something you might want to not tell someone on the first date. It might be something you want to work up to. See if they're comfortable with you. If there's a second date, and then you might say, by the way, you know, this happened to me a couple of years ago, and here's how it affected my life. And
that's the trickiest part. When and how.
Someone here says that's the very trickiest part, is when do you tell someone that you've had a brain injury? When and how do you explain that? And I wish I had like some brilliant, perfect answer for that, but it is a difficult question. It really is.
Can I add one thing? My experience, I started having to do things on my own. I thought, like telling people up front after you start being confused, I suffer from a head injury, so I have to be careful to speak clearly, let me know, and you may have to repeat. I just thought you would get sympathy, or they would be more careful with you and give it to you straight. The other day, I've been taking advantage quite a bit trying to get repairs in my home. I was sold a toilet that's $126. I learned later for $800. You 800. This is the last one that luckily after my kids, sometimes they take time to mom and I tell them that everybody's like, that doesn't make sense. And then somebody, $800. Robert's plumbing and heating, so don't call them because I don't tell them I cannot shut up. I can't stop them saying I have a head injury and I am a widow. I cannot shut up. I feel I need to stop for this time to get it's wrong.
Well, I don't know what's always right and what's wrong. Let me repeat the question so that people around the state can hear what you said. She was telling the story of, she always thought that if you said, you know, I've had a head injury and so you have to communicate carefully with me and talk slowly so I can understand. And she always thought that that would mean that people would be sympathetic. But in fact, sometimes with people, that's not the response that you get. Sometimes people try to take advantage of you, and she mentioned that she'd been taken advantage of in some home repairs recently where someone sold her toilet for $800 that was really only cost $126. And so sometimes your kids help out in negotiating those kind of home repairs and sometimes not. But you find it hard not to say, I've had a head injury. And I guess maybe something to work on is the difference between telling someone that you know, that you're close enough to, I've had a head injury and this is, you know, it helps if you slow down. It's not always a good idea to say that to strangers because they're, you know, it might only be 1% of people out there who are looking for someone to take advantage of, but if they hear something like that, they may really jump on it. And so it may be that it's fine to say that in some social situations where you know someone, you're getting to know someone, but not maybe with a stranger, particularly someone who's trying to get money from you. Is there another question?
One was around, when is it okay to go back to work?
Oh boy, when is it okay to go back to work? I don't have the answer to that. Is there a simple answer to that? I don't think so. I think it really depends on
person to person.
it's yes. So someone here is saying it really varies person to person. It depends on what job you were in before, what kind of job you want afterwards. You know, some people go back within a year. Some people go back within 6 months. Some people, it's very difficult for them still after 3 years. It really depends on what the job is and what the work is. Okay. How does a family member or friend introduce the topic of TBI to a loved one that they suspect may have a TBI but doesn't recognize it themselves? Okay. Well, that's an interesting question. Like I said, you all aren't giving me any easy questions today. I think something to remember is that the very same parts of the brain that are involved in how aware we are of other people, all those social areas of the brain, are the same brain areas that are involved in our self-awareness. So it's possible, and this really is particularly true after more severe brain injuries, that someone may not have a lot of self-insight into the problems that they're having. And I think we're always taught, I don't know whether the person asking this question was a man or a woman, but I think we're always taught to be very polite. And women, I think especially, are taught to be very polite. So you wouldn't want to say something forceful like, hey, that was, you know, inappropriate. Why did you do that? I don't know. In some cases, it might be helpful to just say, here's what happened. Here's what's different from the way it used to be. Let's talk about this. Here's what I think might have been going on. You remember you had that car accident or bike accident or ski accident or whatever it was. And I think it's always good when you're interacting with someone to remember that you can't control the outcome. You can say something that you think might be helpful, but you can't control how the person's going to react or how well that interaction is going to go. But I think it's worth broaching the topic and doing it pretty clearly. All right, so yeah, let me move on to the last couple things, because actually your question was a great segue to our next topic. Financial relationships. So we talked a little bit about exploitation and dating, and we had a great example here. Reading people and telling who you can trust, that's just a difficult thing in general. But particularly if you're having trouble reading body language or facial expressions or just figuring out what other people's intentions are, then that's something that really needs to be worked on and improved before you get into a lot of financial wheeling and dealing. And so it may be helpful to have family and friends help out with this. First of all, they can check people out and say, yeah, that guy seems kind of shady. You know, in terms of like working with home contractors, it may be worthwhile getting on something like Angie's List. That's angieslist.com. I've not been paid for this commercial announcement. Or Yelp.com, and looking up that particular home maintenance provider or plumber or handyman or whatever it is, and seeing what their reputation is, so that you can just pick people who are reliable. So technology actually can help out a little bit here if you don't have friends and family who can help out. In fact, we should probably all check out professionals that we hire in terms of their reputation. That includes neuropsychologists. I think there's also sometimes an issue with impulse control. It's really easy to just, oh, that sounds like such a good deal, I'll just do it. Or, oh, that seems like such a great thing, I need that. And sometimes impulse spending or buying things is a way of getting into financial difficulty and getting into debt. I think that's something that controlling impulses is a good thing to work on in rehab. I think if someone with a brain injury has real difficulty with impulse spending or with extreme cases of exploitation, like the young man I talked about whose dates involved the ATM machine, the family or spouse might consider getting some help with that. Sometimes the courts can appoint someone to be an advocate advisor. I just learned about this yesterday, that this is something that's available. It's just someone to help with finances, or even a temporary conservator. Again, that's someone who manages your finances for you. I think I had another story I was going to tell, but I think we'll just skip that and say there are some solutions that are possible, and I think it's worth making sure that you get help in dealing with finances when you're first recovering from a brain injury. So that's the other handout that I had was on financial safety. It's just some guidelines and some tips that I think are probably good advice for all of us. And again, you can download that from my website, and they're giving you the web page up at the top there. And the BIPN leaders, Brain Injury Professional Networks, and the support group leaders should have those also, and we'll make them available on the BIAC website. So the key message to take home today: social and emotional issues after traumatic brain injury are real brain-based problems. They are just like memory problems, they are just like language problems, they're just like headaches or fatigue. Anyone who's facing these social and emotional challenges after brain injury should not be blamed for them. That's self-forgiveness and other forgiveness, very important. They need for these challenges to be acknowledged, not hidden and made invisible. And they need compassion, support, and understanding. These things can get better with rehabilitation. It takes effort and time to improve on these social and emotional challenges. So a person with a brain injury needs to put that time and effort in, but they can't do it by themselves. They need support from everyone around them to do that. So I'd like to conclude by reading to you something else that my friend who was in a car accident said. It's one thing to reach a midlife crisis and decide you're not happy with where your life is and that you want to make some changes and transform your own identity to a new you that you want to be. It's a whole different thing to have a situation imposed on you that you didn't choose. Your circumstances and abilities have changed after a brain injury in a way that you did not choose for yourself. And you have to create a new identity to fit within those changed circumstances. So I think that friends and family, the social networks around someone with a brain injury really need to understand that and support that. And that's what Brain Injury Awareness Month is about. Thank you very much.